how do we tackle these scholarship applications in a way that feels manageable and hopefully not overwhelming to folks. How you're going to complete your statement of purpose for those scholarship applications. We're going to talk about community and accountability, and then the levels of support that you can get. But again, before it's like, who's this random person I've never met before on the campus who's leading this workshop for TAP? Well, my name is Darcy Anderson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I serve as the senior program coordinator for the Center for Scholars on campus, which means I do academic and non-academic programming for 6 different scholar communities, 4 first-generation scholar communities, our merit-based president scholars, as well as our current and former foster youth. But I started at Cal State Fullerton as an academic advisor, and I'm also a part-time faculty in the honors department currently on campus as well. But before I was all of that, friends, I was myself a first-generation college student that comes from a low-income background. I went to college right out of community college, right out of high school. And I had always dreamed about going to a 4-year, but I went to a high school where I, as a low income student, everyone assumed that my family had money for college. And so if anyone had asked, like, why aren't you applying for college? I would have said, well, I couldn't afford it. And then maybe somebody might have had a conversation with me about scholarships or financial aid, and nobody did. And then ironically, my mom worked at a high school where a lot of people didn't think that those students were going to go on to college. And so she also never had a conversation about those things. And so I did community college right out of high school, and I made the most of it at OCC. Go Pirates. I don't know if I have any OCC folks in the room with us. So I did theater. I did improv. I was an athlete for OCC. I was on the crew team until my knees were like, we're done with rowing. And then I was also on the speech and debate team because I really thought this was going to be my college experience. And right around the time that I was finishing my Associate of Arts, which I jokingly call a Bachelor of Arts from OCC because I did 118 units at OCC, I took advantage of everything I could. Some life happened and I didn't know what was next. And so I decided to take time off and said, like, oh, I'll come back to school eventually. And on that same tip, I had an advisor at Orange Coast College who also told me, yeah, you'll be able to transfer eventually, but you'll have to take one more math class. Y'all, I am a humanities and social sciences person. So when someone told me that there was going to be one more math class, I was like, oh no. So it took me 11 years to finally have the space in my life to decide I wanted to come back to school. And so I went back to OCC and I like got up the curtain and said, okay, I'm going to take this math class. And then that counselor was like, what are you talking about? You don't need another math class. You could transfer right now. And I was like, oh, that would have helped me. So it's part of the reason why I stayed out of school, but also, again, figuring out life. And so when I transferred, my options at that time that I thought were going to be communications or business, because those were the 2 degrees people were telling me about. But I came to learn as I became a fellow Titan, like all of you, because Cal State Fullerton was the first and only 4-year I applied to. I was like, I'll apply to this one because it was way before Cal State Apply was like, oh, you can apply to everything. I just decided to spend my money on one. Then I figured if I didn't get into that, I'd apply somewhere else. But I got into Fullerton as a comm major because I'd spent one day in a business class and decided it was not for me. So I figured, like, I'll do comm. And then even once I got here, I changed majors because I fell in love with American studies, which is the how and why of American history and culture. I know it sounds like Abraham Lincoln, like riding a bald eagle carrying the American flag, but it is really about filling in the silences for everyone in history. And so as I was getting close to the end of my bachelor's, then suddenly my faculty in American Studies were like, what about a master's? And as a first gen transfer student, I was like, what? And so I ended up getting a master's in American Studies as well. And during that time is when I started as an academic advisor. So I have a lot of specialty knowledge in general education advising. I also ironically ran the Finish in 4 and Finish in 2 program, which I definitely was not on that traditional path. And then in January of 2020, I joined the Center for Scholars. So that's a little bit about me professionally and academically, just so you all know. Like, I know what it is to be first generation. I know what it is to be an adult returning. I know what it is to be a transfer student. I have a bonus son, so I've never been like parenting of a little one, but I have been a parenting student and I have been a pregnant student. And so that is why I'm here to hopefully give you all some tips and be the person I would have loved to have had when I was in school, because I definitely didn't have it and TAP wasn't around then. In addition to letting you know a little bit about me as far as who I am academically and professionally. As you can see behind me, I'm also very nerdy. There's a lot of toys and action figures and things behind me. So I'm one big nerd, but I want to let you know all about the allyships that I do hold on our campus. I am a VetNet ally. I am a disability ally. I'm an LGBTQ safe space ally, an undocumented ally, a foster friendly ally, which is also a training that I now facilitate for the campus. And I'm a mental health ally. Those are our allyships I hold on our campus. I am also a mental health first aider within the nation. And so that means I've had extra training, not to diagnose mental health issues, but to support in them. And I don't tell you all these things, y'all, to be like, oh my gosh, look at Darcy, she's so woke. Like, that's not my purpose ever. And it's also not to virtue signal. What it is to let you all know that whether we're in a space like this, on Zoom, whether you see me on campus in the TAP Center, if you see me outside the Center for Scholars, if you end up in one of my classes one day, I want you to know that everybody is welcome in my space, whether we are in person or virtually. And so I always want this to be hopefully a brave space for you all to ask questions and explore what we're going to talk about tonight, because you don't know what you don't know. And I would rather you leave here feeling like you had questions answered than feeling like, oh, I wish I'd asked that, right? But you're still going to have my contact info at the end of this presentation. And I'm going to provide the TAP Center with these slides as well. So if you have any questions and need to review them, you absolutely can. So let's get started, friends. Thanks for letting me introduce myself. I always like to do that because I feel it's weird when you do a presentation and you're like, I don't know this lady, I don't know this person. And so I want you all to get to know me a little bit more. So, scholarship applications. And, I think one of the things that is really challenging for folks is that you see these prompts that they give you. You see these questions that are all blocked together, and they can feel kind of overwhelming. They can feel like, I don't know what I'm supposed to be answering. I don't know what I'm supposed to be like. I don't know what I'm being asked fully. And so that's why we're going to talk about that process tonight with things. And yay, I'm glad to see that there's some OCC people in here as well. Woohoo! Awesome. Thanks for sharing, y'all. So the first thing is, when you're looking at a scholarship prompt, or for those of you who do plan to go on to grad school, we can even frame it as far as like when you're applying to grad school for those statement of purposes, right? So understand what is being asked of you. And I don't just mean like what the questions are, but I'm also talking about, do you understand the terminology they're asking? Right? Because one of the challenging things, I think, for transfer students especially, and it's one of the things that drives me a little bit nuts, is that they assume that us as transfer students, we know how to do college. Well, you've been in community college. You've done this before. Well, different institutions have different terminology. They certainly have different abbreviations and, different kinds of systems, right? Like here at Cal State Fullerton, you have a few advisors you go to, depending on major, GE, maybe minor advising, things like that, versus at a community college, you had like one person in one building, right? And so kind of really understanding what those things are, what those different things are. Also, you want to make sure that if there is a term that they're using, that you understand the way in which they're using it. And here's what I mean. So sometimes, like in my field of American studies, we will see a certain term. Like if I'm thinking about, a term like diversity, right? And thinking about what are they asking me about diversity? Making sure that if you're submitting to a specific scholarship or a specific program, that you are double checking to make sure that your understanding of the word diversity matches up with their understanding of the word diversity, right? And a lot of times you can do that by going to their webpage for program. Programs always have web pages. Everybody's got a web page these days. Usually looking under their values, their mission statement, their vision statement. We'll talk to you a lot about that. But you can also reach out and ask for clarification. That never hurts, because it's better to ask than to assume that you know and then write an entire statement around something that is not the correct usage of a word, right? Or a term based on what their program wants. So that's where you really want to understand what is being asked of you. And so in that, it's like, again, what does the question actually ask? And making sure you're answering that question. And I know y'all, that kind of seems like a no duh, like, yeah, of course I'm going to answer the question. But I can tell you, as somebody who has read a lot of scholarship applications and who has also read a lot of personal statements for grad school, people write around the question a lot instead of just going in. Here's an example. As I mentioned, I work a lot with foster youth. And so some of my youth have come from very, very traumatic backgrounds, which they want to discuss in a scholarship application, but they don't want to get into too many details, which is understandable because you don't owe anyone your story. Just know that. But what happened with one particular student is that she did not make her application personal. It was very generic and general, right? And so when they asked her a question about like what hardship she's faced in her educational journey, this particular student had lost both of her parents in a really tragic way. Now, did she need to go into the details about that? Not at all. She did not. That's not what they're asking for. But she wrote around that question so much, it just made her sound like everyone else that was trying to be just like a good student. Like, look, I've overcome obstacles and I'm fine. Where she has had some much larger challenges than some other students have, right? So she was answering the question, but she was not really answering it. She was writing around it. And so through working together, we, got to a place where she felt comfortable with what she was sharing because we had a relationship, but also she was answering that question in a more personal way that helped her come across more as herself in that application and not just as generic student who's been through stuff. So I hope that makes sense to folks. The next thing you want to think about are what are the limitations, right? Because when we see these statements, it's really important to ask, like, is it a limit on words? Is it a limit on characters, right? This is where your Microsoft Word can come in real handy because it'll tell you how many characters. And oftentimes these applications are not looking for like a 15-page paper. They're looking for tight amounts of pages. And I'll talk a little bit more about word count and character count in a little bit when we break down one of the TAP scholarship statements. But this is important because you want to get close and you don't want to go over. And I know sometimes we think like, oh, if I go over, it'll show that I'm doing more, or it could disqualify you. And we don't want that either. You don't want to be wondering, is it because I went over the pages that I ended up getting disqualified from the scholarship, right? So be aware of your limitations. And then how are you going to submit that personal statement or that scholarship application? This is really important to know because, for some of us who maybe have been out of school, like when I submitted my application to grad school, I had to turn in a physical writing packet with my personal statement and a paper, and my letters of rec were like all in a big manila envelope to that office. Now it's all done online. So you want to find out, am I submitting this through an email? Am I submitting it through a website? Am I asking for a link to be sent? Like, how is it getting submitted? So you really understand. And that especially goes forward as you're looking at asking for letters of rec, or if you're in scholarships that ask for letters of rec, you really want to know how folks are going to be submitting things for yourself. And also to everyone, feel free to answer or ask questions in the chat. And we're also going to have time for Q&A at the end. So one of the most important things about scholarship and personal statements is being authentic. This is so, so important. Again, I will say this to you all many times tonight. Nobody has a right to your story. So you do not have to share every bit about who you are. I don't want you sharing anything that you're uncomfortable with or that causes trauma or re-traumatization for you. That's not what I'm asking. But I want you to be you in these statements. This is really important. Because it needs to, when you read it back, or if you were reading it to someone who knew you, to be like, oh yeah, that clearly sounds like you, right? And so you want to make sure that you're shining through. Like that example that I used with that other student, once we kind of worked through some stuff and dealt with the things she was nervous about, her statement sounded so much more like her, not like generic college student, right? And so we want to make sure that your scholarship application shines for who you are, okay? And so the things like when I talked about myself as a college student in applications and personal statements, I would say things like, I am, my name is Darcy Anderson, and I am a first generation adult returning transfer student from a low income background, right? And so those are all real things about me. Doesn't go into details, but it says a lot in like one sentence, right? And then I would share about the challenges that I had, and I would pepper it with personal experiences. Like my junior year of high school, I would share this a lot where my parents, who knew, because I was a very good student, knew I really wanted to go to a 4-year, and they had to have the talk with me about how they could not afford a 4-year college, right? And so a lot of times I would share those kinds of experiences. Again, not going into all of the details about why my parents couldn't afford that, but that was my story. And so writing that truth comes across as authentic, right? So that's one of the things that you really want to make sure that you're doing. And excuse me, all, I have a little bit of a tickly throat tonight, so I'll be taking some sips in between. And so in that authenticity, does it reflect who you are? Who you are as a student, who you are as a person, right? Because they're not just looking at the grades, they are also looking at you holistically as an entire student and the kinds of things that you're looking for, right? They know that you want money. That's why you're applying for a scholarship. Everyone knows that. So you almost don't even have to say, like, I need the money. They know that. They may ask you for things about like, how will you use this money? But they're aware that you're looking for that. So it's like, is it reflecting your story? Is it reflecting your journey? And you want to consider sometimes discussing the following topics, right? Why do you want to pursue your field of study? Why do you want to apply to that scholarship specifically? What experiences do you have tied to the scholarship program? So thinking about the TAP scholarship, transfer, adult reentry, parenting, and pregnant, right? You may be one of those. You may be all of those. My husband is an alumni from the TAP Center, and so he was 3 out of the 4 of those. He was transfer, adult reentry, and a parenting student when he was in school. So he was able to talk about those kinds of things as he did applications for different scholarships. And also he'll be talking about that as he applies to grad school as well. And then also, what do you want to gain out of your field of study or program? Like, you don't have to understand everything that you're going to do career-wise. And I think this is one of the things that they also put on us as transfer students a lot, which is, well, you're transferring, so you must know exactly what you're going to do. You must have everything mapped out from here on out. And that's just not the reality of. I changed majors again once I got to Cal State Fullerton. But what I did know was a theme. I knew I wanted to help people, and I knew that helping could come in a lot of different ways, right? And so working with students, I get to help people. And then in my field, right, of American Studies, yes, it is about looking at the how and why of American history and culture, and I have more specific fields that I've studied in it. But really, the things I've gotten out of the program is great researching skills, incredible writing skills, communication skills, right? So these different kinds of things that come out of it. And so talking about like, oh, I want to gain, stronger research skills, those kinds of things. It doesn't have to be, I want to come out of here knowing that I will be a forensic accountant for this particular firm. Like it does not have to look like that. So if any of you are feeling that pressure, feeling that like, I don't exactly know, and I have to make a decision, you don't. And here's the other thing. Even if you do know right now and it changes, that's fine. Nobody's coming back to you in 3 years with the scholarship app and going like, but Fatoshi, you said that 3 years ago you were going to follow this field of study. And now I say, like, they don't do that. We think they do that because it gets so ingrained in our mind, but they don't do that. So just some things to think about and be aware of in the process as you're writing. So how do you get started? Sometimes getting started is really the toughest thing. The first thing I do is I recommend that you make a separate Word document for each statement. You can have like a master Word document, right? That has everything you want to write. But let's say you're applying for 4 different scholarships. Title those different documents as those scholarship names. Include your name on there too, to make sure. So mine would say like, let's say Darcy Anderson TAP Scholarship, Darcy Anderson ASI Scholarship, Darcy Anderson American Studies Scholarship, so that I know what I'm talking about in each one. Have your master document, because I don't know about you all, but if I type up something and then delete it, it immediately has left my brain and I may not be able to recreate it. So sometimes having a big long master document really helps. And then break down the question into its parts. And I'm going to show you an example of that in just a few. And then just start getting words onto the paper, okay? And sometimes you can break it down by bullet points, right? And I'll show you that in that example as well. So maybe they're asking for 4 things in a particular application statement. So then maybe give yourself little titles and start writing under each one of those. And it does not have to be perfect. And please understand it's a process. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face in the culture we're in today is we live in a culture of perfection. And this is what I mean by this, is that we are so used to seeing finished products all the time that we don't see all of the drafts, right? So if any of my folks here are on TikTok, right, the Clock app, we see a finished video, a 15-second, a 1-minute video, a 10-minute video, which I can't ever watch a 10-minute video on TikTok, but you see those videos, we see the finished product. What we don't see is the 15, 20 takes it took to get us to that finished product, right? That finished video. Same with YouTube. Same with television shows we watch. Same with books that we read or video games that we play, right? Like we don't see all the behind the scenes, but there were drafts. There were versions that came before. And so I think we get stuck thinking if I don't do it perfect the first time, I might as well not do it. And that's really about fixed mindset, not growth mindset. And so we want to make sure that we understand it's a process. I, as someone who writes a lot, has to remind myself that it is a process. And so I want to encourage you all to know that it is a process. It does not have to be perfect. And guess what? It's never going to be perfect. It just needs to really be a reflection of who you are. Have people look over it. Have people who know you read it. Have people who you trust read it. Because one, and I'm sure folks can attest to this, you know how you've looked at something so many times and you're just like, and then you don't notice that like spell check went over a word because it's a real word, but it's not the right word, right? So for example, I was reading a book the other day and the word should have been silence, but the word there was science. And of course it didn't get caught because science is a real word. It's just not the right word for there. So you want to make sure other people look at it so you can make sure you're catching those things. And I also recommend read it out loud. read it out loud to yourself. Because as you read things, you will also catch your pacing and you will catch typos as well. So those are some really important things that I recommend. And also use the Cal State Fullerton Writing Center. We have incredible resources here at Cal State Fullerton that can help you, right? You can get Grammarly for free through software at Cal State Fullerton, which is awesome. But also we have the Writing Center that can have people, you take a draft in, you take your prompt in and say, this is what I'm trying to answer. Is this answering it? That's so important because if you've done your due diligence and you're submitting like, hey, I've submitted the best thing I can, great. Then you know you've done what you can do. And that doesn't mean that those applications and those personal statements will not evolve over time, because I would not submit the same personal statement I did back in 2015 for a grad school program now. But that doesn't mean it was bad then. It's just things have evolved for me and things have changed for me, right? And so you can evolve and you can change, but you want to make sure that you're doing the most you can with what you're trying to submit. Okay. And again, doesn't have to be perfect. Here's a whole slide that reminds you all, it does not have to be perfect. It just needs to be a reflection of who you are and your experience. And just a reminder that your experience does not need to look like anybody else's, and it won't look like anybody else's. All of us have our own unique educational path. And I know that as someone who has a non-traditional, or as we like to call it in TAP, new traditional path, for a long time, I was like, oh, I wished that I just had that same, path that so many of my peers did from high school. But in reality now, I'm so glad I had my own way because I discovered American Studies. I'm in this field that I never expected to be in, and I love it. And that's because I followed my path and I was open to my experiences. So I want to validate all of you that your experiences and your path is exactly that. It's yours. And it doesn't need to be anyone else's, right? And so we want to take that experience and we want to make sure we put it into that statement as well. So let's look at an example. Here is the TAP Scholarship Personal Statement, right? So let me read through this, and then again, we're going to break it down. So TAP Scholarship Personal Statement. Personal statement, no more than 2 pages, double spaced. Include the following. Tell us about yourself and your academic and professional goals. What motivated you to return to college, and how will you use your degree in your career choice? What are some obstacles, barriers that you have had to overcome to get where you are today, and how do they relate to your education and career path? How many folks, show of hands, feel a little bit overwhelmed by that? Anyone feel like that's yeah, yeah, like okay, right? Like a little bit like, ooh, that's a lot. Yeah, right. So we've got that, like that is a lot. But that's why what we do is we're going to, oh, come on, Zoom, you're fighting me right now. Sorry, everybody. Is we are going to break it down, right? So if we break it down, then it breaks down into like 4 sentences. So the first part is really about what they're looking for and what your limitations are. This is going to be a personal statement that's no more than 2 pages double spaced. 2 pages double spaced is 1 page single spaced. Okay. 500 words, just to keep in mind for you, 500 words is a half a page, single spaced. 1,000 words, if you're looking at a word count, is 1 page single space. And so again, thinking about those kinds of things. And this is a way that I like to trick myself when I'm working on longer papers, right? When they go like 10 to 15 pages, double space. And then you go, oh my gosh, that's so much. But then if I break it down to single space, that's 5 to 7 pages. I can do that, right? So with this, for TAP, we're just asking for no more than 2 pages double space, including the following. So that's the first part, our limitations. So now let's get into what are they asking, right? Tell us about yourself and your academic and your professional goals, okay? So there's 3 things in there that you can even break down further if you need to. So tell us about yourself. Who are you as a student, as a person, right? What are your academic goals? What are your professional goals? And again, those academic and professional goals don't have to be so crazy detailed, right? Like I said, I didn't, when I switched to American Studies, people were like, what are you going to do with that? You're going to teach? I'm like, I could teach. That is something I could do. But I knew I wanted to help people, and I trusted that when I moved into the profession, whatever the profession was going to be, that my passion was going to carry into it, right? And so I was able to write about taking American Studies out into the world. So you can attack that first part as one piece or in 3 ways, right? And again, as you're writing that statement, maybe consider different little titles for yourself. About me, academic goals, personal goals. And then as you refine that, start to make it a little bit more narrative, right? So it flows a little bit more. Then we go into the second part. What motivated you to return to college, and how will you use your degree in your career choice? Again, there's 2 parts in that, right? What motivated you to return to college? As TAP folks, maybe it is being a first gen, maybe it is your kids, maybe it is your family, maybe it is your supporters, maybe it is your siblings that weren't able to. Whatever that motivation, and maybe it's just you, right? You are enough motivation in that. And then also, how will you use your degree in your career choice? And again, this is where I just want to remind you, it does not have to be so detailed. It does not have to be this idea of like my degree and my job match, because a reminder that we only have 85 degrees on our campus at Cal State Fullerton, but there are thousands and thousands of different jobs in the world, right? If I personally was waiting around for a job that matched my degree, I would still be waiting for a job, y'all, because there is no American studier degree like that or job. There's no job that is that. So what I have used my degree, so here's an example. As a senior program coordinator. So my areas, just to give you a little bit more about myself, the areas I study in American Studies are race and ethnicity, gender and sexuality, ideals and institutions, and death, dying, and grief in American culture. Okay, those 4 things. I work with students in a very high touch capacity, so I build a lot of relationship with my students. We talk about academics, but oftentimes we're also talking about them holistically, and so that means we're talking about life. So as somebody I'm aware of how I present, I am a white lady in a position of authority for most of them, but if I can understand things about all of those different aspects of who they are, right? And that's not to say, oh, I totally know what you're going through. That's not what I'm saying. But if I have a better understanding because of what I've worked with in my fields, I can better serve my students, right? Because all of those things affects us on a daily basis in one way or another. So those are some of the ways I can use my degree in my current career choice, right? But also when I'm looking at my research skills that I've learned, my communication skills, my writing skills, all of those things go into myself as a senior program coordinator, right? Because sometimes if I'm presenting, let's say, at a conference on trauma-informed practice, which I do quite often, I need to be able to research the current findings on my topic to make sure that I'm presenting the best information, right? So these are different kinds of things that I can take my degree into my career choice, right? And even if, again, if it's more of a theme, like, oh, I want to help people, then you are saying, I want to take my human services degree, my accounting degree, my business admin degree, my criminal justice degree, whatever your degree is, because I feel all degrees are good degrees. Just has to be the right major and degree for you. That's really important. So how you can use those. And again, like I mentioned earlier, nobody's going to come back in 3 years and be like, oh, hey, Jonathan, like we noticed that you changed some things up. They're not going to ask that. So try and take that weight off you if you can. And again, those 2 parts you can break down. You can break this all down into smaller parts. And then the third part that they're asking are what are some obstacles / barriers that you have overcome to get to where you are today, and how do they relate to your education and your career path? So again, you can break that down into 2 or 3 parts. So what are obstacles or barriers that you've overcome to get to where you are today? That's 1. How do they relate to your education? That's 2. And how do they relate to your career path? That's 3. So you can break it down even further. But even in this, looking at this page here compared to this page here, this is all one. Woo, 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 woo. Like, oh my gosh, this is so much. But here it's like, oh. And then if you want to break it down even further, it becomes even more manageable. And so perhaps you decide to when you get started, you're like, oh, you know what I'm going to do? Today, I'm going to talk about myself. I'm just write that part out, right? Or for some of you, I tend to write like this a little bit. I might lay out all those titles, all those broken down parts, and then I'll write on one area for a while that I can. If I run out of steam on that, I'll move to another part and say, oh, I'm going to write a little bit about this and a little bit about this. So then it gets my brain thinking about these things. I'll take a break. I'll walk away, go on a walk my dog, eat dinner, go to class, whatever it is. And then other things are going to come up. So then you make a note of that and you come back to your drafts. Right. And so this is how we break it down. That way, too, you can come back, because when you look at this type of full paragraph for me, because my brain sometimes just like skips over things. I don't know if anyone else has that problem where they're like, yeah, I just totally omitted that whole part they needed. Right. But if I break it down like this, I can go back and really look and say, did I hit all these points? And when I am asking folks to help me, right, other people to look over things, then I can say, hey, did I hit this point? Do you feel like this is, you know, more about me and my academic and professional goals? Yes, I do. Or maybe you should add in more things about this, right? So you can really help, you know, make sure you're hitting all of those points. Okay. So that is kind of my general presentation on how we're going to do things.